While Angola didn't kick out the Portuguese, the Kingdom of Congo did different. Pedro II was the first to fully kick out the Portuguese, and this was because there was riots by individuals who had had enough with the Portuguese. Part of the reason why the Kingdom of Angola was considered an enemy of the Kingdom of Congo was because they sided so heavily with the Portuguese. There is this farce, this scam, this falsity that claims that Africans never did anything to try and halt the slave trade or stop slavery from going to America. Instead, they went out of their way to try and do this. And of course, when they couldn't, they had to work with the Europeans in order to make sure that the slave trade operated in a way where random people wouldn't just disappear, including nobles, because that's what happens when your country is overrun by slavers. A good example of this would be in Europe when the Middle Easterners came in at the same time and they were raiding slaves. They didn't have a path of taking them back. They would just have to accept that the Middle Easterners now owned some of their people. As far as the Africans, in order to fight slavery, this is what they did. The slave trade in freeborn Bakongo was strictly prohibited for much of the 16th and 17th century, as well as for most of the domestic slaves, and the Manikongos went to great lengths to ensure both groups protection, including going as far as ransoming back hundreds of enslaved Bakongo from Brazil and Sao Tome in two notable episodes. The first was during the reign of Alvaro I, 1568 to 1587, after the Yaga invasion of Congo, in which several Bakongo were captured but later returned to Alvaro's demands, and secondly during the reign of the Mani Congo Pedro II, 1622 to 1624, when over 1,000 Bakongo were returned to Congo from Brazil as part of the demands made by Pedro following the Portugal's defeat by Congo's army at Mbandakasi in 1623. Added to this was Congo's ban on both the export and local purchase of enslaved women, which, similar to Benin's initial ban on exporting enslaved women, that soon became a blanket ban on all slave exports, because Congo mostly purchased rather than captured its slaves in war after the mid 16th century. It was soon outstripped by neighbors such as Ndongo and Loanga, the latter of which diverted its northeastern sources. There were a lot of forces that were acting against the Portuguese that made sure that they would never colonize the Kingdom of Congo while they colonized Angola. The Kingdom of Congo became uncolonized until the 1800s, even though the Portuguese had first landed in the Kingdom of Congo in the 1500s. So over 300 years, just like the Japanese, the Europeans did nothing in their regions because of people like Njinga, because of people like Pedro, because of other natives, because of the Bangala, because of the Yaga, and so many other people who were hostile to the Portuguese. Even the nickname the white man's grave started to be used. Trade from outside of the borders of the Kingdom of Congo continued, but not on land. They would always remain just outside the kingdom. trading with intermediaries and trading with other middlemen who will get some of the stuff that the Africans desired in there, but slavery itself basically was halted. Meanwhile, in Japan, the same thing was already happening there. The Portuguese had been suspected and were subject to be put in Dejima, an island where they would operate from. And from this island, they were supposed to only focus on trade and not be a nuisance with their religion. But the natives of Japan who had converted revolted and they isolated themselves in a building and they went to war or at least tried to protect themselves from the Japanese general. Now, in this rebellion, the Portuguese decided to support these native Christians. On the other hand, the Dutch supported the non Christians. Because of this, the Portuguese, after the Christian rebellion was squashed, the Dutch were allowed to move in to where the Portuguese were, and the Portuguese were kicked out. And at the same time, in the kingdom of Congo, the Portuguese were kicked out and replaced by other groups. The history of the Kingdom of Congo is reflected in their official language today because the majority of their languages are African based languages, with one exception, which is French, not Portuguese. And that French is Belgian French that came in when the Belgians took over the Congo in the late 1800s, whereas Portuguese is the main language of both Mozambique and Angola, their original colonies in Africa.